Brandon Lawson was a 26-year-old father of four living in San Angelo, Texas with his common-law wife, Ladessa Lofton. The couple had moved their children to the new location just a year prior, and were living just a few miles away from Brandon's brother, Kyle. On the evening of August 8, 2013, Brandon and Ladessa had an argument, and Brandon decided to drive to his father's home, located several hours away in Crowley, Texas, near Fort Worth. Brandon's father, Brad, tried to talk his son out of the trip, as it was late at night and he didn't want him making such a long drive. Brandon persisted, though, and at approximately 11:54 p.m., he left home and was soon driving through a desolate area on Highway 277, first north towards Abilene, before he would eventually turn east. Brandon would never make it as far as Abilene. Some 40 miles down the road, he ran out of gas and called his brother for help. Kyle and his girlfriend Audrey called Ladessa and asked if they could borrow a gas can to bring to Brandon. Brandon had taken the phone chargers with him, so Ladessa placed her phone in the car to charge, left the gas on the porch, and went to bed. While driving down Highway 277, they received several phone calls from Brandon, but the calls are dropped and have poor reception. They think that he said he was bleeding. They arrive at Brandon's abandoned truck at 1:18 a.m. and find a Coke County Sheriff's deputy there who informs them that they received a call about a vehicle on the side of the road. After checking the area, turning on the hazard lights, and locking the doors, the deputy drives away. Kyle and Audrey did not tell him that Brandon was supposed to be there. Brandon has an old warrant out for his arrest, and they don't want him to be found and taken in. They will not find out until much later that 24 minutes earlier, at 12:54 a.m., Brandon had made a frantic call to 911 asking for the police. The call itself has become the subject of great speculation and debate, as Brandon's speech is rapid and hard to understand. To this day, no one knows with certainty exactly what he said. Brandon manages to get a call through and tells Kyle that he's just 10 minutes up the road. For the next several hours, Kyle and Audrey search the area but can find no signs of Brandon. They place multiple calls to his phone until at 3 a.m., it begins going straight to voicemail. Ladessa wakes at 4:30 a.m. and finds a few missed calls from Brandon, but she can't get him on the line either. She gets in touch with Kyle, who tells her that they cannot find Brandon and they've been looking for hours. Over the next days, weeks, and months, the family would search for Brandon and become embroiled in a dispute with the Coke County Sheriff's Department. While Ladessa, Kyle, and the rest of his family believe something horrible has happened to Brandon, the Sheriff's Department brushes it off as a felon fleeing from a warrant. A week after he vanishes, they finally agree to conduct a search of the area. After several searches, nothing can be located, and the Sheriff's Department refuses to search without new evidence, despite local landowners granting them the permission to do so. Some 4 years later, and there has never been another sighting of Brandon. A great deal of speculation rises up over the years, much of it based on misinformation. While the media touches on the story, for the most part, only one paper in the area is given exclusive access to the details. The very paper where the sheriff's wife works. And it slants its articles to suggest Brandon ran away despite his 911 call and the abandonment of his vehicle and family. What happened to Brandon Lawson? Did he have past demons which came back to haunt him? Was he involved in drugs and involved in a dispute with a supplier? Was Brandon under the influence of something which disoriented him enough to get lost in the rugged terrain? Did he stumble onto a violent person's land and get shot as a trespasser? Is it possible he abandoned the woman he had been with since high school and his 4 children to run off or avoid being arrested for an old warrant? Or did Brandon witness something that night that caused someone to murder him? This is Trace Evidence, Episode 17, The Disappearance of Brandon Lawson. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today's episode focuses on the disappearance of Brandon Lawson. It has quickly become the most requested case I have, and while the story is extremely sad, it's also entirely bizarre and confusing. Before we move into the case, just a few notes about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focused on missing persons and unsolved murders. We're available across multiple platforms and on iTunes, Google Play Music, Stitcher, and more. Trace Evidence has a Patreon for those of you who wish to support the podcast. It can be found at patreon.com/traceevidence. This podcast is a complete one-man operation, so if you enjoy it and wish to help support it, please check out the Patreon page. Links, information, and more items, including YouTube videos and full episode transcripts, can be found on our website at trace-evidence.com. If you'd like to contact me, you can email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, tweet me at traceevpod, that's TRACEEVPOD, or join me on the Facebook discussion group simply by searching for Trace Evidence Podcast or clicking the direct links on the website. If you have questions, comments, or case suggestions, I'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy the show, please rate and review us on whatever app or platform you're listening on. The more ratings and reviews we get, the easier it becomes to find the podcast, and the more attention can be given to the cases that I cover. Today we look into the disappearance of Brandon Lawson. This is a strange case, with a cryptic 911 call and an allegedly unhelpful sheriff's department. This is a case that has been requested a lot, and one which I'm very familiar with. There are a lot of questions that don't have answers, and a family desperate for a break. This is episode 17, The Disappearance of Brandon Lawson. In August of 2013, 26-year-old Brandon Lawson was living in San Angelo, Texas, a small town boasting just over 100,000 residents. He lived with his longtime girlfriend, Ladessa Lofton, who was also defined as his common-law wife. Brandon was father to 4 children, 3 girls and 1 boy, one of whom he'd had with a woman earlier in his life, and 3 of which Ladessa was mother to. Ladessa and Brandon had been together for nearly 10 years, having moved from Fort Worth to San Angelo approximately 1 year prior. The two met when they were in high school. Brandon was 16 and Ladessa was 15. They had been together ever since, and some have described the two as not only best friends, but inseparable. Brandon was an oil field worker, described by friends and family as a hardworking man who loved his children and Ladessa. The couple had hit some rough patches over the years, but they were ultimately described as well-suited for one another and happy to be together. All of these factors ultimately make Brandon's disappearance even more suspect. Brandon is described as being 5 foot 9 inches tall, weighing approximately 230 pounds. He had short brown hair and blue eyes. He has multiple tattoos on his arms, as well as scars on his chin and left knee. One ear is also pierced. When he was last seen, he was wearing a yellow shirt, camouflage shorts, and white 2013 Air Max shoes. On August 8, 2013, sometime between the hours of 10 p.m. and 11:53 p.m., Brandon and Ladessa got into an argument. There were several factors that have been noted as being pivotal to the argument, namely that one of their 4 children had been suffering from an ear infection for a few days, and Brandon was stressed out about beginning a new job. Factor that in with the complications that can arise between a couple who have been together for 10 years and have 4 children to raise while still being in their early 20s, and it isn't difficult to imagine the context of the argument, though we do not know for certain what exactly was said by either side. This wasn't their first argument, and typically when things got out of hand, either Brandon or Ladessa would leave the home for 20 to 30 minutes to cool off and calm down so that they could finish the conversation civilly and move forward. On the other hand, I did read several accounts which report that the argument was actually about Brandon's lifestyle. Some people have reported that Brandon, excited to have gotten a new job and successfully passing his drug test, came home late and was possibly under the influence which caused an argument between the two. It appears to be speculative, but the exact context of the argument isn't known for certain, and considering factors which will be discussed later, whether or not drugs or alcohol played a role in his disappearance is a point of high debate. Whatever the reason for the argument, on this night in particular, Brandon makes the choice to leave, but it isn't going to be for just 20 or 30 minutes. Brandon makes a call to his father, Brad Lawson, who lived in Crowley, Texas, not far from Fort Worth, approximately 247 miles and just under a 4 hours drive away. During this conversation, Brandon explains to his father that he'd gotten into an argument with Ladessa, and he wanted to come out to his house and spend the night there. Bear in mind, this call is made sometime between 10:45 and 11:53 p.m., meaning that were Brandon to drive out to his father's, he likely wouldn't have arrived prior to 2 or 3 in the morning. Reportedly, Brandon's father tried to talk him out of making the trip and told him to just take a few minutes to calm down and go back home to Ladessa and the children. Brad Lawson's words apparently had no effect on Brandon's decision, as he left his home at approximately 11:54 p.m., apparently planning to drive to his father's. In several places, it's pointed out that rather than hopping on Highway 67, heading east towards Crowley, Brandon instead drives onto Highway 277, a very rural and desolate stretch of road which heads north to Abilene before turning east to Crowley. A lot of people have pointed to this choice as an indication that Brandon may have had a different destination in mind, or changed his mind at the last minute and decided to head towards Abilene. According to my research, if Brandon had taken Highway 67 instead, his distance traveled and approximate time of travel would have been 220 miles in 3 hours and 43 minutes. On the other hand, the route that he took along Highway 277 is calculated as being 247 miles and 3 hours and 44 minutes. Essentially, these two routes, though taking different paths, would carry Brandon to his father's home without much of a difference in miles traveled and a 1-minute difference in time traveled. When asked later about the events of the day, Ladessa would state, quote, "It was a typical day. We got into an argument and he left the house. I talked to him one time after he left the house," end quote. According to Ladessa, she called Brandon not long after he left the home. She was upset about the argument, but wanted to talk to him and make sure everything was all right and that they would work it out. She further says that she told Brandon to drive around for a little bit, clear his head, and then come back home. She also told him that if he didn't want to come home that night, he should drive over to his brother Kyle's house, which was located just 5 minutes down the road. I've always found it fascinating that following their argument, and in his desire to leave the house, Brandon would choose his father's home, a 4-hour drive away, over the option of his brother's house and just a 5-minute drive. There is some confusion around this time frame, at least from my perspective. Brandon left the home at 11:54. Ladessa calls him sometime after this and tells him to go to his brother's or to come home. At 12:10 a.m., Brandon's brother Kyle arrives to check on Ladessa. This means that in the 16 minutes between Brandon leaving and Kyle arriving, Ladessa made a call to Brandon and then became so concerned that she also made a call to Kyle, who drove 5 minutes over to check on her. This seems to be contrary to the suggestion that whenever they argued, they would take a few minutes to cool off. Or perhaps the argument was worse than we're aware of. Brandon could have only been gone a maximum of 10 minutes before Ladessa called Kyle, since Kyle would have had to have left his home by 12:05 to make the 5-minute drive and arrive by 12:10. That seems like a very small window of time for these calls to be made. Details such as these are also pointed at when people speculate that Brandon may have been under the influence of something, which would have given Ladessa heightened concern, but again, this is only speculative. According to the official timeline, sometime between 12:30 and 12:38 a.m., Brandon places a call to Kyle and tells him that he's run out of gas and he needs his brother to bring him some. Brandon had made it 40 miles away and ran out of gas just 4.5 miles from Bronte, Texas. He's a 1/4 mile from a rest stop. Kyle places a phone call to Ladessa, telling her that he and his girlfriend, Audrey, will be stopping by the house to borrow a gas can so they can help Brandon out. Ladessa tells Kyle that she will leave the can on the porch since she's planning to take a shower and go to bed. It's sometime around this phone call that Ladessa realizes Brandon took the only phone charger they owned, which plugs into a wall socket, and the only other one she has is in her car, so she goes out to her car, plugs her phone into charge, goes back in to shower and go to bed. This is also a strange set of circumstances as Ladessa was so concerned about Brandon that she called his brother earlier, but when she finds out he's broken down and needs gas, she doesn't volunteer to go along or take her own car. She instead decides to shower and go to bed. Some have speculated that she felt more secure knowing where Brandon was, while others have theorized that she didn't want to go along and possibly have another argument. Either way, Kyle and Audrey stop by the house and retrieve the gas can. The timeline shows that Brandon then places 3 calls to Ladessa, though she doesn't get them since her phone is in the car. The calls come in at approximately 12:34, 12:36, and 12:48. No voicemails are left, and Ladessa won't discover the missed calls until later. During this time, Kyle and Audrey begin driving towards Brandon's last known location, just south of Bronte. Kyle had some issues with his paycheck not being cleared into his bank account yet, so he can't afford to fill the gas can. Instead, he plans to drive out to Brandon, take him to a service station where Brandon can pay to fill the gas can, and then he'll drive him back to his truck. Something went wrong though, and no one has yet been able to figure out exactly what it was. At approximately 12:54 a.m., just 16 minutes after his call to Kyle, and 6 minutes after his last call to Ladessa, Brandon dials 911. There is a recording of this call, but it's extremely difficult to determine what exactly is being said. There have been countless attempts to clean it up, to slow it down, and break it down word for word, but that has only led to many different transcriptions of what was said, and even then, no one knows exactly what it means. What we do know is that Brandon sounds like he's either in a full-blown panic or is under the influence of something which impacts his speech. I'm going to play the full 911 audio for you without my interpretation, and then once more with it.
911 emergency.
Yes, I'm in the middle of the field. The state was just pushing guys over. Right here going towards Javelin on both sides. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. Got taken to the woods. 3:30.
Okay, now run that by me.
When I talked to him, I actually ran into him.
Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
That's the first guy.
Do you need an ambulance?
Yes, no, I need the call.
Okay. Is anybody hurt? Hello?
I'm going to play it for you one more time, this time slowed down and cleaned up a little bit, and this is credit of the Lost and Missing Google page on YouTube.
911 emergency.
Yes, I'm in the middle of the field. The state was just pushing guys over. Right here going towards Javelin on both sides. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here that got taken to the woods. 3:30.
Okay, now run that by me.
When I talked to him, I actually ran into him.
Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
That's the first guy.
Do you need an ambulance?
No, I need the cops.
Okay. Is anybody hurt? Hello?
Everybody has their own interpretation of this audio. It's extremely difficult to make out exactly what is said in the call, and it's very quick. In my interpretation, this is what I hear Brandon say. Yeah, I'm in the middle of a field. A scraper just pulled some guys over right here going towards Abilene on both sides. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here that got chased into the woods. Please hurry. At this point, the operator asks him to repeat himself, and it sounds like he says, "There's one guy talking to him. I totally ran into him." The operator thinks she's dealing with an accident and repeats that he ran into him. Then it sounds like Brandon says, "Just the first guy." She then asks if he needs an ambulance, to which Brandon clearly responds, "No, I need the cops." I'm going to play it again, but this time I'm going to break it down sentence by sentence.
Yes, I'm in the middle of the field. The state was just pushing guys over.
So again, when I hear that sentence, I hear, yes, I'm in the middle of a field. A scraper or a staper just pulled some guys over.
Right here going towards Javelin on both sides.
Right here, going towards Abilene on both sides. Although some people think he says, right here, going towards Abilene on Bront side.
My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here that got taken to the woods.
My truck ran out of gas. There's one guy or one car here that got chased into the woods or put into the woods.
Police words. Okay, now run that by me.
At this point, he says, please hurry, and the 911 operator starts to ask him to run it by her again, and he starts to talk. It's almost impossible to hear what he says due to the overlapping dialogue.
And we're not talking to him. I still ran into him.
At this point, I either hear, we're not talking to him, I totally ran into him, or there's one guy talking to him, I totally ran into him.
Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
Just the first guy.
So the operator thinks she's dealing with an accident and says, oh, you ran into him. And I hear him say, just the first guy. Some people interpret this as shot the first guy.
Do you need an ambulance?
No, I need the cops.
The operator asks him if he needs an ambulance, and he says, no, I need the cops. Some people have heard him say, yeah, no, I need the cops. Other people think someone else said yeah. To me personally, I think it was a grunting sound, like he was moving or trying to get through something, so it was like, ugh, no, I need the cops.
Okay. Is anybody hurt? Hello?
At this point, Brandon doesn't speak again. The 911 operator asks if anybody's hurt, and some people say at this point they hear a voice say, yeah, or something like that. I don't personally hear that. All you hear after that is ambient sounds of the environment, and I couldn't tell you if that's the sounds where Brandon is or the sounds where this 911 call was taken. But I don't interpret anything in there. Other people hear gunshots, they hear car tires. I personally don't hear any of that. A lot of times, when I listen to this call, I get the distinct impression that there's someone else there with Brandon. When he says,
And we're not talking to him. I still ran into him.
it sounds like he says, there's one guy talking to him. But it also can sound like he says, no, we're not talking to him. And it doesn't sound like this statement is directed towards the 911 operator, but someone else there who asked him a question. Others have said they hear voices in the call, and though I can sort of pick up on that, I can't say for sure. It's bizarre. Extremely bizarre. If you search for this 911 call, you can find it in all forms and fashions, from slowed down to pitched up. People have extensively studied this call, attempting to figure out what exactly was said, but still no one knows for sure. There are theories that Brandon references a state trooper in the call, or that he witnesses someone being shot, but it's hard to determine what exactly is going on. The call, though, seems to suggest that after Brandon's truck ran out of gas, he either began walking down the road and came upon something strange, or something strange came upon him while he was waiting at his truck. What's interesting is that, during this call, at no point does the 911 operator ask for Brandon's name or other vital information, which is typically standard procedure. This has led to speculation that the released 911 audio has been edited, but there may be another explanation. The Coke County Sheriff's Department did not have a dedicated team of 911 operators. Instead, all inbound 911 calls were answered by nurses at a local nursing home. What level of training these nurses had in regard to emergency calls, if any, is unknown. The family, when they learned about the 911 call, requested a copy. It took the Sheriff's Department several months to provide them with this one. I've also read that the 911 call audio you just listened to is not in fact an official police audio release, but that Ladessa recorded the call when the Sheriff's Department played it for her, which could explain some flaws in the quality if true. The full circumstances around this call are highly suspicious. Some say that Brandon sounds intoxicated in the call, but that's almost impossible to determine. Many believe he is simply talking rapidly because he's come across something very messed up and his adrenaline is pumping. In reference to the call itself, Coke County Sheriff Wayne McCutcheon stated, quote, Brandon said he had run out of gas, he needed the police, and something else about hitting somebody. But it was so garbled, and the 911 kept having to ask him what he was saying. I don't know if it was a bad connection, he was talking really fast, and it was hard to understand him. End quote. 8 minutes after this call, at approximately 1:02 a.m., the Coke County Sheriff's Office receives another call from a trucker who tells them that there's a vehicle on the side of the road, but partially sticking into the highway. A deputy was dispatched to check on the vehicle and, if possible, remove it from the road. At approximately the same time, Kyle places a call to Brandon asking for the specific location of his truck. According to both Kyle and Audrey, the phone call reception was poor and their calls kept being dropped. Kyle states that on one of these calls he heard Brandon say, quote, "I'm 10 minutes away, hurry up and get here, I'm bleeding," end quote. At 1:10 a.m., Kyle and Audrey arrive at Brandon's truck, where they find Coke County Sheriff's Deputy Neil beside the vehicle. There's also an account that Kyle received a call from Brandon while at the truck, in which he only understood Brandon as saying, quote, "I'm in the field," end quote. According to Deputy Neil, there's no visible damage to Brandon's truck, and his keys and wallet are not inside. His cell phone is also missing. Interestingly, Deputy Neil informs Kyle that he was responding to a call from a passing trucker about an abandoned vehicle. Neil does not mention the 911 call which Brandon placed requesting cops and for them to hurry, possibly because he himself is not aware of the call at the time. In fact, the Lawson family will not be made aware that Brandon called 911 that night until much later when they review his cell phone records. Kyle doesn't mention Brandon to the deputy, nor that he may be nearby, as he is aware that there's a warrant out for Brandon. The warrant was issued in Johnson County in 2005, and up until a few weeks prior, Brandon wasn't aware of it. According to his former neighbor, Lori Norris, it was a felony warrant for possession of a controlled substance. This has led some to believe that Brandon was hiding, not from a strange event, but from the police themselves. Of course, this completely contradicts with the fact that he called 911 and specifically asked for the police. Kyle would later state that when Brandon became aware of his warrant, he began saving money to hire a lawyer and sort it all out, that he never considered running. When asked about this later, Ladessa stated, quote, "Brandon would never run from his kids, and while he had an outstanding warrant, we were in the process of saving to pay his fine and addressing it through our lawyer," end quote. At approximately 1:18 a.m., Audrey sends a text to Brandon's phone telling him that there's a police officer at the vehicle. Deputy Neil opens the truck, turns the hazard lights on, locks the doors, and puts in an order for the truck to be towed at 8 a.m. the next day, and he leaves. He shines a spotlight on the way down the road on the lookout for the driver, but doesn't see anyone. Shortly after this, Kyle and Audrey get back into their car and begin driving around looking for Brandon. Sometime while they're driving, Brandon calls Audrey's phone, but again, poor reception makes the call drop. Audrey would later state that Brandon said he was bleeding, and that was all she could make out about the call. Kyle makes several attempted calls to Ladessa, but they go straight to her voicemail. Frustrated and confused, Kyle calls several co-workers to help search for Brandon. The men arrive to help search, although we don't know if they did a foot search of the area or if they just drove around the road calling out for Brandon. During this time, Kyle continually makes calls to Brandon's cell phone, and at 3 a.m., the phone stops ringing, either because it's been powered off or because the battery died. At approximately 4:30 a.m., Ladessa wakes up and retrieves her phone from the charger in the car. She finds missed calls from Brandon and Kyle. She listens to her voicemail and finds several messages from Kyle in which he's frantically looking for his brother. First, she attempts to call Brandon, but all of the calls go straight to voicemail. She then calls Kyle, who tells her that they haven't found any sign of Brandon, and that he and Audrey are going to leave the gas can in the bed of Brandon's truck and go home, planning to resume searching when the sun rises. Ladessa immediately calls the sheriff's department to ask if they have found Brandon, but they tell her they have not. A few hours later, at 7 a.m., Kyle returns to the truck and fills the gas tank, now that his paycheck is cleared. Extremely worried and with no signs nor contact from Brandon, Kyle decides to call the police and tell them the whole story, including that the previous night when he met Deputy Neil at the truck, he was looking for his missing brother, and that he had received phone calls from him stating that he was bleeding. The response of law enforcement is not hurried, as they seem to take a stance that Brandon is not missing, but has chosen to flee due to his outstanding warrant. In fact, the first major search conducted for Brandon is done by plane, which Ladessa herself pays for out of pocket. She would pay for 2 more later. Ladessa, Kyle, and several friends and family members also conducted a ground search, but were severely limited as many of the landowners along Highway 277 wouldn't allow them to search their property. The police didn't conduct their first search until Tuesday, August 16th, a week after Brandon disappeared. The first search is done by plane utilizing infrared cameras. This was a controversial move, considering that at this point, were Brandon out in the wilderness somewhere, it was unlikely that he was still alive, and an infrared camera wouldn't result in anything helpful since it looks for body heat. Then, some 13 days later, a total of 20 days after Brandon went missing, police finally conducted a ground search in which they covered 2,500 acres of land surrounding the site where Brandon's truck was found abandoned. The search team consisted of Coke County Sheriff's Department, the Texas Rangers, the San Angelo Fire Department, the Tom Green County Sheriff's Office, the Department of Public Safety, the Highway Patrol, the Criminal Investigative Division, and a search and rescue tracker. All-terrain vehicles were provided to assist by Carl Beal of Texana Ranch. No signs of Brandon were found. The final official search was conducted on October 24th, 2 months and 13 days after Brandon disappeared, and utilized 6 cadaver dogs and members of Texas Search and Rescue, who also utilized the dogs' trainers for the search. Again, nothing was found. When asked about the searches, Sheriff McCutcheon said, quote, "They covered about 3,000 acres. We only have one point where he was known to be at. You can't search all of Coke County, it's a physical impossibility. And we have no idea if he went north, south, east, or west. We don't know if he got picked up by a truck driver. We don't know if a member of the family came out there and got him." End quote. McCutcheon would go on to say that since his disappearance, they had received several anonymous tips saying Brandon was in San Angelo, Fort Worth, and everywhere in between. After Brandon's disappearance, a bitter debate would begin between his family and law enforcement. The family has accused the sheriff of being involved in a misinformation campaign. The Observer Enterprise is a local newspaper which serves Coke County and surrounding areas. They've put out several stories on Brandon, the details of which have been hotly debated. Among these details is a cell phone ping which was done to locate Brandon's cell phone. The ping had a hit on Brandon's phone some 3 miles away from the location of his truck. According to the Observer Enterprise, the investigation would be going in a different direction unless new evidence could be found. But the family argues that the cell phone ping is new evidence and that it's an area which has never been searched. The mistakes of the paper could easily have been chalked up to poor research or improper fact-checking if not for one important detail. The paper is run by Sheriff McCutcheon's wife. Aside from misinformation being published, there was also a concern. Details of the case, which would be known only to those investigating it, was finding its way into the articles of the Observer, while other media outlets were being cold-shouldered. It has been argued that the paper, along with law enforcement, didn't consider Brandon to be a missing person, but in fact a fleeing felon, and that they handled the case accordingly. The problem many people have with this claim is that a fleeing felon doesn't typically call 911 and request that police come to his location. In addition to this, the warrant for Brandon was nearly 8 years old by the time he vanished, and according to friends and family, the authorities knew where he was, and he had made no attempts to conceal his location, so if they had wanted to arrest him, they had plenty of time to do so. In addition to these issues, the family has reported that the sheriff's department has actively attempted to deter them in their search efforts. On several occasions, they were told not to search property for which they weren't given permission, which they hadn't been doing anyway. On one particular occasion, Brandon's father Brad said that he was riding an ATV around the area when a sheriff's deputy pulled up. When Brad asked the deputy what he was doing there, the deputy responded that he was just making sure Brad didn't go onto any property that he wasn't allowed onto. Several pieces of information came out following Brandon's disappearance, which led many to be suspicious of the circumstances. First and foremost, there's a rumor that shortly before he disappeared, Brandon cashed out all of his 401k savings. When asked about this, Ladessa says that he thought about it, but he didn't actually do it. Riley Crane was Brandon's supervisor at Renegade Well Services, and when asked about the 401k, stated, quote, "I'm not sure if that's right or not. I've heard some people say that, but I don't think he really did it." End quote. Then, just a month after Brandon vanished, Ladessa moved out of their home and went back to Fort Worth area. Many people found it suspicious that after just a month she would move away, but Ladessa made it clear that she had spent an extensive amount of money on search efforts for Brandon and the lease was up. She had 4 children to take care of and simply couldn't afford to live there any longer. There are quite a few theories about what could have happened to Brandon, and they cover a wide spectrum of possibilities. Sadly, with the limited information that we have, theories are really all there is to go on. The first theory is that Brandon ran into trouble somehow related to drugs. Many people have theorized that Brandon was on drugs at the time he vanished, and have propped that theory up with the knowledge that there was an arrest warrant issued years earlier for possession of a controlled substance. The possible connection to drugs leads into several different theories regarding his disappearance. First and foremost, that Brandon was under the influence the night he vanished. Following this line of thought, it is suggested that Brandon ran out of gas and was so out of it that his speaking was inhibited and he wandered off into the fields and woods of the area, getting further and further from the road and becoming more and more disoriented. Many people have even suggested that whenever he was calling 911 about was less something that happened to him and more something that may have been occurring in his mind as a result of drug use. Somewhat similar to the Rico Harris disappearance, many people believe that Brandon just got lost while under the influence and simply couldn't find his way back, or was injured or killed in the rough terrain. Another theory tied into the drugs is that Brandon may have been involved in the drug trade in the past, and in some way, in the early morning hours of August 9th, 2013, he may have run into someone from that past who was looking to pay him back. People support this theory by suggesting that Brandon's choice of road that night, Highway 277 instead of Highway 67, was not a choice made arbitrarily, but that due to his argument with Ladessa and the stress of his life, he was making a trip to purchase drugs from someone he knew in the area. It isn't uncommon for former drug users to fall back into their old habits in response to stress, and many surmise that Brandon could possibly have been falling back into that world, or maybe even he was just looking to get a fix for one night. Some have gone so far as to suggest that Brandon may have contacted a former drug connection who decided to set him up. The reasons behind this, though, are typically much less vivid than the theory itself, as many have a hard time coming up with supporting theories. Outside of the drug-related theories, there's the theory that Brandon left his vehicle in order to walk to the rest stop that was located just a quarter mile down the road and found himself lost. In several of the phone calls, it's reported that Brandon makes reference to bleeding, and many people think that Brandon may have cut himself on brush or even tripped and injured himself in the darkness. Under this theory, Brandon wandered deeper into the wilderness and became lost or severely injured to the point that he couldn't make it out. It's also been brought up that this particular area has some wildlife which could have hurt or killed Brandon, including wild boars and poisonous snakes. The area is described as being full of ditches and wells and many sundry places where a man could fall and never be found. Some people have theorized that Brandon may have been murdered by one of the local landowners. We know police were very involved in making sure to keep the family away from that land, and have turned down offers to search more of it themselves. Typically, in areas such as this, landowners have a keen eye for trespassers who may be trying to steal or pass through their land. Many of them react violently when this happens, or at least threaten violence, and when they live in that kind of a desolate area, they're going to own a gun. So many people think that Brandon wandered through the wrong man's property and caught a bullet for his trouble, and was disposed of in one of the numerous wells, ditches, and gravel pits nearby. Law enforcement believed one of two possibilities: that Brandon either ran off to start a new life, a theory which almost always gets put forward when an adult vanishes, or that Brandon chose to run away because of the warrant that had been issued for him. Brandon's family firmly believes that he didn't choose to leave of his own volition, and that the warrant wasn't that big of a deal and was something Brandon was working to take care of. Unfortunately, law enforcement may not have acted as thoroughly or as quickly as they could have given the circumstances and their own theories. Regardless of their flawed search, they still believe that this disappearance may have been a result of Brandon's own free will. They point to the warrant and to the argument he had with Ladessa the night he left home as reasons behind Brandon choosing to disappear. In terms of why his truck was abandoned, the 911 call, and the fact that there has been no activity on his bank accounts or social security number since that day, they have no answers. Interestingly, many people believe Brandon may have fled, and while the family have argued that he would never abandon his children, some believe he didn't. There's a theory that Brandon orchestrated his disappearance that night and that his family facilitated it and knows exactly where he is. On the flip side of that coin, there's also a theory that a member of Brandon's own family may have been involved in causing him to disappear. When asked about these possibilities, Marcus Jones, a former co-worker of Brandon, stated, quote, "His brother was kind of tore up about it, but not acting like someone who had just lost his brother. More like he might have known something was coming. He wasn't real informative, but kept the same story. It's all kind of fishy to me." End quote. The theories turn darker from here, with all of them coming as a result of Brandon's 911 call. There are a million theories on what was being said in that call, but all of them seem to agree on one thing. Brandon came across something that night that resulted in his possible murder. Some people believe that in the early part of the call, Brandon says something referring to a state trooper. Many have theorized that Brandon either witnessed a police officer involved in criminal activity such as drug running or murder, and that he fled the scene, which resulted in him either being hunted down or murdered, or getting so deep into the wilderness that he couldn't find his way out when his phone died. They point to the poor management of the case and the seeming lack of interest from law enforcement as support that the entire situation was a cover-up. Others believe that Brandon either came upon illegal activity or was offered a ride from someone who was up to no good. The last ping from Brandon's cell phone was nearly 3 miles away from his vehicle. That's a large distance to cover if you're moving through fields and brush in pitch darkness. So, many people believe Brandon either hitched a ride or was offered one, and things went bad from there, with Brandon escaping the vehicle and being chased. They also theorized he could have walked up on something, such as a murder or drug trade, and when he was spotted, he got pursued and was either murdered or became lost and later died of exposure. In the 4 years since Brandon vanished, there have been no new leads, no suspects, no real answers. Investigators have been stagnant in examining the case further and conducting additional searches. When asked about whether or not he believed his son was located nearby where his vehicle was, Brad Lawson stated, quote, "There's nowhere to go out there. Pitch dark, 1 in the morning, his cell phone battery dies so he had no flashlight. It's rocky cactus terrain out there. If he had fell down or something, we would have found him in a search. Nobody has showed me Brandon. If they would, I'd go get him and bring him home, and I'd put him where he belongs, with his family. But until that day, I'm not giving up hope." End quote. Ladessa would state in an interview, quote, "It's the hardest thing I've ever been through, just not knowing. I mean, it's devastating. You don't know what to do anymore. Sometimes I just can't believe that this happened. I guess you watch stuff on TV and listen to radio stations, and you look at the person and you hear something really devastating or bad, and you listen to it for a minute, and a lot of people just go on. But this, it's me. Now it's happened to me. So now, when I see other stuff, I try to share it as much as I can, or care more, because you never know what's going to happen in life." End quote. When asked about what she believed happened to Brandon, she said, quote, "I think he's out in that field. There are wild hogs, there are wild steaks, you know. There are all kinds of things out there that can do stuff to you, and coyotes. There's so many ditches, so many wells, so many stuff you can fall into, you know? I think something got him. I don't know what got him." End quote. We may never know what happened to Brandon Lawson. It's been over 4 years, and nothing new has been brought to the surface. His family continues to be involved in search efforts, and Ladessa has set up a Facebook page called Help Find Brandon Lawson, on which she frequently posts. The family have organized group searches, balloon releases, and vigils. There's also a website located at missingbrandonlawson.com, which is run by them. The case has grown in notoriety over the past few years, with several podcasts covering it. But at the end of the day, a father, a brother, a a son, a husband is missing, and we just don't know what happened to him. At this point, his family believes he is deceased, and now they only hope to bring home his remains and give him a proper burial. Perhaps someday, someone will come across a new piece of evidence, or some answers. But until then, the disappearance of Brandon Lawson remains a strange and suspicious mystery.
Hey guys, my name is Ariel Jane. I'm a longtime Alaskan and true crime junkie who decided to combine those two things into my podcast, Murder Under the Midnight Sun. I cover a wide variety of crimes from the 49th state, as well as the occasional case from somewhere else. So check out my podcast and you'll hear all about the dark side of this majestic state. Available on iTunes and Stitcher.
Brandon Lawson's disappearance isn't exactly an unknown, though it hasn't gotten total media attention as many other cases have. I first heard Brandon's story a few years ago and began looking into it. Like many, I was fascinated by the 911 call and wanted to discern what was being said. Since that time, I've read a lot of news articles and interviews. I've listened to a few podcasts, watched some YouTube videos, and if you're really fascinated by this case, more than likely you've already studied it a bit too. But if you haven't, there's a lot of information out there. The irony is that for all the people who have studied the case, adjusted the audio, and tried to figure out what Brandon was saying, we're still in the same place where we were when Brandon vanished. Nobody has any answers. This case has bothered me since the very beginning. For those Brandon left behind, his disappearance haunts every day of their lives. Unfortunately, they weren't given the kind of help you would expect. Instead, they were mired down in controversy with law enforcement acting almost disinterested, to a media who, for the most part, barely touched the story. Since the explosion of true crime podcasts, several have given attention to this case. I've personally heard it on The Vanished, Generation Y, and True Crime Garage, who did an amazing job breaking down the 911 audio. I do try to stick to cases with less coverage, but this is a case that's been requested multiple times, and for me in my format, I try to spend more time on the victims. I've seen people disputing podcasts for hitting on cases that have been done too much, but at the end of the day, someone's gone and their family's desperate for answers. Any attention that can be given can be helpful, so if this case has grabbed your attention, definitely check out some of the other shows that have hit on it. Before I get into the theories, I wanted to address a few details about the hours prior to Brandon's disappearance. There's been a lot of debate about the context of the argument that Brandon and Ladessa got into before he left. Frankly, unless she comes out and gives us the specific details, we won't know exactly what happened. Some people have said it was just general life issues such as raising children, while others who suggested it had to do with Brandon partying and possibly abusing drugs. If you've ever been in an argument with your significant other, you know that the slightest comment can lead to an all-out war within minutes. I don't know what the details of the argument are, and I don't know that they're all that important, though I do believe that if it was about drugs or alcohol, that could play a role in Brandon's disappearance. I think this issue can be a quagmire that a lot of people get caught up in, and though it's not an insignificant detail, it's also not the most important. Brandon left, and for whatever reason, he wanted to make the hours-long trip to his father's house instead of minutes to his brother's. I've always wondered why, but no answers have ever really come to the surface. Also, Brandon's father tried to talk him out of coming that night. There could be a myriad of reasons why, with people speculating that maybe his father could tell he was under the influence, or he just didn't want his son to be driving several hours through a desolate area in the middle of the night. Maybe he just had a level head and told his son to calm down, go home, and things would be better in the morning. We don't exactly know, but I don't think that his father trying to talk him out of the trip carries a great deal of weight in regard to what happens later. I do think there's something strange about the consistency of phone calls that night. If Brandon left around 11:54, as Ladessa has stated, and she called him and spoke to him at least once before his brother Kyle, who arrived at the house at 12:10, that's a really small window of time for a lot of things to happen. If I got into an argument with my girlfriend and she stormed out, and I called her, and she was still angry and told me she was going to her father's house, I don't think I'd immediately pick up the phone and call her sister and ask her to come over. I feel like there must have been something in the argument itself, or in that phone call, that made Ladessa feel scared enough to call Kyle. That's completely speculation on my part, but I simply can't accept that he'd been gone 10 minutes and already are looking for assistance from his brother. Kyle gets to the house, talks to Ladessa, and goes home. He doesn't go out looking for Brandon, he doesn't try and call him. So whatever the details were, he didn't feel as concerned as she did. Maybe it's just general run-of-the-mill upset from the argument and wondering if he's going to leave you stuff, but it's all strange to me. The next thing is the 911 call itself. I've listened to it more than you could possibly imagine over the years. Every time I do, I think I'm going to figure out what it is this time, but I never do. I typically hear the same thing, maybe with a little variation here and there. To me, it sounds like Brandon came across something or someone that has him seriously scared, and he's on the move. People have claimed to have heard other voices, whispers, gunshots. I can't admit to hearing any of that, which is partially because the call quality is so poor to begin with. It's sort of like listening to white noise. After a while, you'll start to hear things in it the same way that when you stare at a pattern or into the darkness, you might start to create shapes or see faces. It's how our senses function. But when I listen, I only hear the fast-paced speech of Brandon and various environmental sounds. Whether or not his speech is impacted by the adrenaline rush of what he's experienced, the use of some kind of drugs or alcohol, or a combination of all of the above, I can't say for sure. His speech doesn't sound slurred to me so much as it sounds rapid. The call itself was a disaster for several reasons, including the lack of a trained 911 operator and what amounts to an extremely poor quality recording. So what happened to Brandon Lawson that night? We have several theories to examine, and each of them has its own merits and evidentiary support. Of course, each theory has its detractors, and there's so much conflict, controversy, and contradictory evidence, it can be difficult to know which is most reliable. We begin with the first theory, that whatever happened to Brandon that night had to do either with his current use of drugs, current interest in getting drugs, or his past use of drugs. We know Brandon had a warrant out for his arrest for possession of a controlled substance. This has been the foundation upon which many people have built a theory that at the time he vanished, Brandon was on drugs and struggling. We don't really have any actual evidence to support this, and according to both his job and Ladessa, he'd passed recent drug tests. Of course, I've known a great deal of people whose immediate response to passing a drug test is to go out and get high, and a lot of jobs test you on the way in, but rarely test you once you've already been hired on. I personally think it's possible that Brandon was doing something drug-related, but I don't know that it would have had any connection to his past. If he'd had a warrant out for him since 2005, I have to believe that anyone from his past who was looking for revenge or payback would have gotten to him by then. In addition to that, Brandon's decision to drive that night, as far as we're aware, was the result of an argument and therefore spur of the moment. No one could have been waiting there to ambush him, and even if they were, they couldn't have known the exact spot where he would run out of gas. I think the idea that someone murdered Brandon as a result of something to do with his past is an extremely thin theory. The family has his call records, which they got from Verizon. This is the way they found out about the 911 call in the first place. If there were any other calls or texts from that time period that would suggest Brandon had contacted anyone else or was looking to make a connection, I think we would have heard about it by now. They haven't been shy about releasing information that they think could be helpful, so I consider it highly unlikely that this is what happened here. I don't believe Brandon was on his way to pick up drugs or to meet anyone in reference to them. Whether or not he was under the influence and they played a role, that could be a different story. It's not completely unusual for someone who's been off drugs for a while to dive back in and become a little overwhelmed. I think that drug use could have led to Brandon becoming lost that night, not being able to find his way back, or being injured, but I also believe that something drove him off the road in the first place. He had the clarity of mind to call 911, to call his brother and ask for gas, to call Audrey several times. This doesn't sound to me like someone who's so inebriated that he can't tell where he's going or what he's doing. I consider it a possibility that Brandon was on something, as much as I consider it a possibility that he wasn't. But I don't believe whatever happened to him that night was related to drug use, at least not his own. Is it possible that Brandon came across some kind of a drug deal, and when he was noticed they decided to kill him? I think that has to be a possibility. Some people have pointed to drug cartels being involved, and with the proximity of Texas to the Mexican border, that can't be ruled out. That being said, I don't imagine that any major drug traffickers are going to be making exchanges in the middle of the night on a highway. I could see them doing it in the woods or far off the road, and it's certainly possible that Brandon saw something from a distance or was spotted by someone acting as a lookout. I live in a rural area, and a lot of drug-related activities go on in the deep wooded areas around here. Whatever was going on there that night, Brandon was in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's definitely possible that he walked into something that he couldn't walk out of. Another theory is that Brandon, either tired of waiting for his brother or feeling like his brother might not be able to find him, decided he was going to make the quarter-mile walk to the nearest rest area as a better point of reference. If this is the case, you'd assume he would have called his brother with his plan, but he never did. Or if he did, his brother couldn't hear him because of the poor reception up there. Why he wouldn't walk along the road, I don't know, but this theory would lead us to believe that Brandon walked off the road and became lost somewhere in the rugged terrain, or worse yet, became injured or maybe even fell into a hole or well in the area and was unable to escape. Though this is possible, I feel like this theory completely rejects the 911 call. If Brandon were walking and merely found himself lost, I doubt he would have called 911 and sounded as panicked as he did. He probably would also have said that he was lost. Remember in the call, he specifically asked for the police. I don't think this is the type of thing you do if you're lost. You would call and say you need help, you would say you're lost, but I don't think you'd say, I need the cops. I don't give much weight to this theory at all, unless it began as a walk to the rest area and that's when Brandon came across something strange. Local landowners are considered another possibility. In areas such as these, people can be very protective of their land, and it's not uncommon for them to own guns and to threaten potential trespassers. That being said, I think if this had been the case, it's really unlikely that someone who owned land up there was going to notice a lone man walking by at that time. If they had, they might threaten him or yell at him, but it seems like a rather large leap to assume that they would murder him. On the other hand, if they were doing something on their land at that time of night and didn't want anyone else to see, that's a completely different story. In that case, I could see Brandon being threatened, chased, or even murdered to cover something up. The one piece of information, which makes me wonder the most, is that the police seemed interested in keeping the family off the land. The landowners themselves offered to allow police to search everywhere they wanted, but the family's not been allowed to. There could be a lot of reasons for this, but it's a little odd to me. Also, these landowners could have known the area well enough to have known where to dispose of a body so that it wouldn't be found. Unfortunately, there isn't much to go on here. There's a lot of speculation, but no hard evidence. It's a real vague theory, and it's a possibility, but it does feel less likely. That brings us to the two theories put forward by law enforcement. Either Brandon chose to run off, or he was running away because of the warrant. These are essentially the same theory and suggest that Brandon chose to leave. There's a ton of problems with this particular set of theories. First of all, Brandon didn't take any personal items with him, so if he was choosing to run off, he would have had to have been willing to leave everything behind. In addition to this, he left his truck on the side of the road, but took the keys with him. This tells me that he was planning to come back and start his truck that night, once his brother got him some gas. Also, if there's anything people are readily willing to volunteer about Brandon, it's how much he loved his kids. No one believes he would have left them. I know that this theory has to be considered, but just based on the information alone, it makes it hard to believe. Assuming on the very thin premise that Brandon did choose to leave, why did he call 911? He doesn't sound like a man who's trying to get away, and if the warrant scared him that much, would he be asking for the cops? Some people have suggested that Brandon was hiding in the field to avoid the cops because his vehicle was abandoned and a cop may come to check it out. While Kyle was at the truck, he didn't mention anything about Brandon because he was worried that the officer might run the plates and arrest Brandon if he saw him. Audrey texted Brandon to warn him that a cop was at the truck. Sure, I can easily see Brandon not wanting to get arrested, but all of this was done when neither Audrey, Kyle, nor apparently the officer were aware of Brandon's 911 call. He was clearly in distress and needed help. I don't think that warrant was anywhere on his mind at that moment. I don't believe that Brandon was hiding from the police. I also don't believe that his disappearance was by his own choice. Now, there's another subset to this theory, that Brandon chose to disappear and that his family helped him do it. I can't really make sense out of that theory, and frankly, if his family helped him, then they're incredible actors. Every interview I've seen with anyone involved in this situation seems genuine to me. I know there were some comments made about Kyle's brother's behavior after his disappearance, but it's hard to judge how someone deals with something like that. I suppose what you'd have to do is go to motive, and I can't find one for why Brandon would want to disappear with the help of his family. If he loved his kids as much as everyone said he did, I sincerely doubt he'd want to put them through this kind of trauma. Also, when you look at the money spent to hire search planes to look for him, this would be a very costly cover-up by the family. I honestly don't put any weight into this theory. That leaves us with the final two theories, which are also the most popular, and in my opinion, the most likely. These two theories follow the line that Brandon came upon illegal activities that night and was pursued and possibly murdered as a result of this. Where they vary is that one theory ascribes these activities to random people, while the other would lead us to believe that Brandon saw police involved in something criminal. Starting with the latter first, a lot of people believe somewhere in the 911 audio you can hear Brandon make reference to a trooper, a stater, a state trooper. They believe that in this call you hear him make this reference, that he goes on to say that the trooper shot someone, and that someone else, maybe even himself, has been chased into the woods. I don't know what exactly he could have come across involving a cop. Maybe a bribe, maybe some kind of a drug deal. It can be speculated about endlessly. But if he saw a police officer pulling someone over or shooting at someone, he would have had every reason to be scared for his life and on the run. Some people have claimed that you can hear gunshots in the audio. I personally don't. I also don't think Brandon sounds as though he's witnessing a murder or a majorly violent event. I think if he were, he may be more likely to have talked about needing help more than he did, and to have said they're shooting someone or they're going to kill me or something like that. But again, it's hard to know for sure how people will react in those situations. A lot of people believe that this is the reason the sheriff's department was so unhelpful with the investigation. Many believe that it was a major cover-up and it was cops looking out for cops. Although this is possible, and certainly not unheard of, I just can't feel sure of it. I think the police in this case screwed up the investigation out of a lack of care, more so than out of a concerted effort to cover anything up. Also, and maybe it's just me, but I feel like if I saw a cop doing something illegal and then he was chasing me, I don't think I'd feel safe calling 911. How would I know that they would help me and not help the cop instead? I would have called my brother and told him what was going on. I've read a lot of things about the police in that area at this time being involved in a lot of strange activities. I've heard rumors of corruption, but I haven't seen anything really solid to provide me with enough proof of it. One thing I do find fascinating is the other 911 call that night. It comes in 8 minutes after Brandon's 911 call, and it reportedly is a passing driver who notices Brandon's truck abandoned on the side of the road and notes it as a road hazard. I really wish we had the audio from that call, because if this person is passing through 8 minutes later, that's a very small amount of time after whatever happened to Brandon. Did this person see anything or hear anything else? We may never know the answers to this because we don't even know who this person was. Kyle, Audrey, and Deputy Neal arrive at Brandon's car sometime around 1:10 a.m. This is 16 minutes after the call. None of them reported anything out of the ordinary. There's no damage to Brandon's truck, and it's been left unlocked. It's really hard to say. I can understand the tendency to believe the cops must have been involved in some way, considering the way they handled things later, but for me, I just can't make this connection. I consider the theory possible, but not the most likely. I consider it more likely that the sheriff's department just bungled this entire investigation based on false pretenses. So that leaves the last theory, that Brandon came upon people doing something illegal and was chased or murdered by them. I think this theory has two branches. Either that Brandon walked in on something illegal, or he caught a ride with someone or a group of people and they were doing something illegal. I feel like there's a possibility that Brandon was driven at some point. He told Kyle at one point that he was 10 minutes up the road. People use 10 minutes to describe a lot of different distances and periods of time, but to me, this isn't what you say if you're only a short walk up the road. Also, we know that the last ping on Brandon's cell was 3 miles away from his truck. I don't know the exact details of the ping, but 3 miles is a pretty far distance from where he started walking. According to Kyle and Audrey, in several of his phone calls he noted that he was bleeding. We don't know if he was bleeding because someone did something to him, or if he was bleeding because he got scratched up or fell or was cut somewhere in the surrounding environment. A lot of that area has been looked at since Brandon vanished, and nothing's ever been found. Ladessa has said she believes he's out there somewhere, but I honestly don't. I don't think he's laying in a field somewhere, and I don't think he ever was. I believe that Brandon was likely murdered, and whoever murdered him moved his body. One thing is that Brandon's 911 call doesn't cut out. It's poor quality, but the signal doesn't drop. With each subsequent call, the signal gets worse, and Kyle and Audrey have a greater difficulty in understanding him. To me, that suggests Brandon was now in an area where his reception has gotten poor. Then again, Audrey and Kyle's cell phones might have had bad reception. He could have walked far enough for his reception to have gotten bad, but he could have also been driven far enough for that to happen. Also, if these were people who regularly conducted criminal activities in that area, they would have likely known places to get rid of him, and they'd probably run across people before. We know there were wells and gravel pits in the area, and plenty of open space where he could have been buried. Kyle has said that he tried to call his brother for several more hours, and that it wasn't until 3 a.m. that the phone started going straight to voicemail. I believe Brandon's phone was probably dropped at some point in time, or he was in a position where he was unable to answer. Whatever happened to Brandon happened before that phone battery died. I firmly believe that if he could have answered those calls, he would have. To me, the most likely theory is that Brandon came across a group of people doing something and he paid for it with his life. It's such a strange story, and it only gets stranger as more years pass and we continue to have no new information. Brandon's children who were young when he left are now old enough to ask where their father is and why he hasn't come home. His family wants to know what happened to him, and they want to bring him home for a proper burial. It's one of those impossible disappeared into thin air cases, and yet despite a possible lead in terms of a cell phone ping, the police seem uninterested in investigating further. Short of the discovery of a body, a confession, or a miraculous break in the case, we may never know what happened to Brandon Lawson. It's truly one of the most mysterious cases I've ever dug into, and certainly just as tragic as all of them. It's been 4 years since the last time Brandon Lawson was seen, and the last known sign of his existence is a poor quality 911 call that leaves us with so many more questions than it does answers. If you're interested in finding more information about the disappearance of Brandon Lawson, visit missingbrandonlawson.com or simply search for his name. There's plenty of websites, forums, and blogs discussing him. If you have any information in regard to his disappearance, please contact Crime Stoppers, the FBI, or your local police. What do you believe happened to Brandon Lawson? Tweet me at TraceEvPod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. A special shout out to Ariel Jane, the host of Murder Under the Midnight Sun, a true crime podcast that I'm a big fan of. You heard a promo for her show earlier, and you should definitely give it a listen. It's quickly become one of my favorites. I want to thank you for listening to this episode of Trace Evidence and invite you to check out our website at trace-evidence.com. You can find links to our Patreon, all of our social media accounts, as well as places to download and subscribe to the podcast. I'm always eager to hear your feedback and to get your case suggestions. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a good rating on iTunes and leave us a review. This will greatly help our reach and bring more attention to the cases we cover. Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join us next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.